afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's PRIA webinar, The Rise of Journalism. Premier Global Services are proud to sponsor PRIA's webinar series and bring you the technology behind today's call. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the PRIA website. The question and answer session will be conducted by web chat only. If you have a question throughout the program, please post it using the Question Manager window located at the top of your screen. I'd now like to hand over to your moderator, Lloyd Gross, National Information Officer of the Public Relations Institute of Australia. Please go ahead, Lloyd.
Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Let me start by thanking Premier Global, who generously support the PRIA by sponsoring our webinar series. Today we bring you Eric Beecher, who will discuss the challenges that threaten a strong and independent fourth estate and how PR as a key stakeholder can work with our colleagues in the media to strengthen their position. There aren't many more people more qualified than Eric to talk on this topic. He was recognised by the Walkley Foundation in 2007 with the Leadership in Journalism Award. He's worked as a reporter in The Age, the Sunday Times, The Observer, the Washington Post, and has also been editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and editor-in-chief of Melbourne Herald and Weekly Times. Eric is a co-owner of Crikey, SmartCompany, Eureka Report, and a founder of Business Spectator. And without further ado, let me introduce Eric, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Lloyd. Okay, I'm assuming here that people know what churnalism is. The Nick Davies from Flat Earth News definition is the practice of regurgitating material rapidly under pressure from outside sources without checking. I think those last two words are pretty pivotal. I think most of you know what PR is, and I wanted to put in my own definition of quality journalism, which I think is a distinction from journalism generally. And I describe it as the practice of gathering, checking, contextualising and presenting information in the form of news analysis or commentary about issues of importance or relevance. So they're the three kind of component parts that we're going to be talking about today. In my mind, there's no doubt that journalism, so-called journalism and PR generally, are on the rise, and I think there are two factors driving that. The first is that the resources for journalism in mainstream media particularly are declining, in some cases quite dramatically, and at the same time the role and rise of PR is occurring, and so the combination of those two events I think is resulting in more journalism and more PR and a greater presence for PR in the media. On the surface, that may appear good for PR because it means you get your messages into the media sometimes unfiltered or less filtered than used to happen. But I would argue that I'm not sure it's necessarily good for PR, and that's certainly, in my view, not good for journalism, because the key to quality journalism and the impact it has on its audiences, in my view, is trust. And if that trust starts to break down because there's the role of the journalist as a mediator is no longer as powerful, then I think everyone suffers, because the media suffers and journalism suffers. As I imagine most of you know, quality journalism is under tremendous pressure at the moment. This has been building up for a small number of years, but over the past year the pressures have grown at a much greater rate, and that's being driven by two things: structural changes to the business model of media, particularly newspapers, but also broadcast media, and the problem has been compounded in the last year by the economic downturn, which has removed large swathes of advertising revenue. So we've got a sort of vicious cycle here where the funding is going down, there's fewer editorial resources, the quality of journalism goes down, and that makes it even less respected by its audiences. At the same time, there's an interesting trend, and I'm kind of caught up to some extent in the middle of this, which is the trend where journalists, well-known, high-profile, highly qualified journalists, are themselves becoming brands in their own right. The example for me closest to home, because I'm involved with Business Spectator, are the three respected business commentators, Alan Kohler, Robert Gottliebson and Stephen Bartholomew, all of whom 2 years ago were writing prolifically in newspapers, and all of whom left their newspapers to join me and others as owners of Business Spectator, and they took their brands with them. They brought their credibility, and they brought their authority, and they brought their contacts and their connections and their brands. And so as news becomes a commodity, it seems to me that the role of commentary and analysis becomes even more important. In the case of the three I mentioned, we call them the KGB at Business Spectator. At Crikey, it's about providing the audience with what we describe as the story behind the story. At SmartCompany and Eureka Report, which are specialist sites, we have highly qualified journalists and commentators and analysts there. And so as all this unfolds, the question is, how can the mass media, the general interest media, possibly maintain their preeminence if this kind of trend continues? Now, the truth is that old media companies, and when I say old media, I'm talking predominantly here about the commercial TV networks and the big newspaper companies, and to a lesser extent the commercial radio companies, and to a probably even lesser extent the magazine companies. They are all confronted with the same almost insuperable challenge, that their business model, which is dependent on advertising revenue and their slice of the advertising pie being substantial, which it has been historically, supporting the journalism and everything else they do, and also delivering very large profits. That business model is now being pulled apart, primarily by the rise of the internet. The internet now carries more advertising revenue than all media in this country except TV and newspapers. In the UK, internet revenues will overtake newspapers either this year or next year, and in various parts of the world it's growing at different rates, but it's growing prodigiously. And this means that the revenues, particularly from classified advertising in newspapers, the so-called rivers of gold, are peeling away at a great rate. And in the case of classified advertising, it's entirely logical, because the internet is a vastly superior medium and a vastly cheaper medium for classified advertising. And so I don't think many people in our industry would be surprised if the rate of decline in classified advertising volumes in newspapers continues, that within a few years there'll be very little classified advertising left in newspapers. And so old media are struggling to find a new commercial paradigm, and at the same time they're also trying to beef up their online efforts. But it's very, very difficult to be both an attacker and a defender. They have to try and attack by having a presence in the online media, but at the same time they are defending profits, dwindling profits, but nevertheless still